They smelled smoke before they saw it. The wind carried it low through the trees, thin and strange, just enough to make the horse fidget beneath him. George Wetzel tugged gently on the reins, eyes narrowing. The trail back to the homestead had been quiet until now. Too quiet. His cousin Lewis hadn't said a word in over an hour. They'd bagged only one squirrel between them that morning, and both boys had that restless, unsettled feel in their bones, the kind that didn't come from empty traps or cold feet. Now the smoke twisted up in lazy curls just above the ridge. George nudged his horse forward. Lewis didn't move. Something was wrong. The smell wasn't hearth smoke. It was thicker, oily, wrong. George didn't speak. He just slipped down from the saddle and crept forward through the brush. Lewis followed, silent, low to the ground, his musket clutched tight. They crested the ridge, and that's when they saw it. The cabin was gone. Only the stone chimney stood, surrounded by the collapsed shell of charred timbers. The corn patch was trampled, the lean-to burned to ash. The fence was broken in half a dozen places, with hoof prints gouged deep in the frozen mud. And scattered across the yard were bodies. George lurched forward, then froze. Mary Wetzel lay face down near the doorframe, her apron soaked red, one hand outstretched as if she'd been crawling. Beside the hearth was Martin, his head caved in. Further back, something small and pale lay crumpled in the weeds. George turned away, chest heaving. Lewis didn't move. His face didn't change. He just stared at the bodies, silent, eyes flicking from one to the next, counting. His sister wasn't there. Neither was Jacob. The ground felt hollow beneath them. The silence was too heavy. George put a hand on Lewis's shoulder, but the boy didn't seem to feel it. "They might be alive," George said. Lewis didn't speak. He turned and followed the muddy tracks toward the woods. The trail was clear. Too clear. A party of warriors, Shawnee by the look of the prints, had taken the remaining children captive and vanished into the timber. The prints veered south toward the Ohio River. After a mile, George turned back. They needed help. Lewis did not turn back. He kept walking. At Fort Henry, the story spread quick. Another homestead burned, another family torn apart. But there was something strange about this one. Something people wouldn't forget. Lewis Wetzel was only 12 years old when his family was massacred, and in the weeks that followed, he seemed to stop being a child entirely. At first, he wouldn't speak. He sat by the remains of the cabin for 2 days, refusing food, not responding to questions. He carved the initials of his siblings into the blackened porch beam and stared at the fire until his eyes dried out. Then, without warning, he was gone. They found him 3 days later in the woods, with a tomahawk in one hand and 2 scalps tied to his belt. He didn't explain. He didn't brag. He simply walked back to the fort, cleaned the blood from his blade, and sat down by the fire. From that day on, Lewis Wetzel would be known by every man on the frontier and feared by every warrior west of the river. But that part of the story hadn't happened yet. First came the trail. First came the rage. The captives hadn't made it far. A few miles beyond the ridge, the Shawnee camped near a creek crossing, not bothering to hide their fire. It was the kind of arrogance that came from too many easy kills. Lewis found them at nightfall. He didn't wait. He didn't plan. He crept through the brush until he was close enough to see the glint of firelight on painted skin. Then he waited for one to wander off to relieve himself and slit his throat in the dark. The next one went down with an axe to the spine. The third turned just in time to raise his rifle before Lewis put a knife in his neck. The fourth didn't fall so easily. They fought in the mud, tooth and nail, the man twice Lewis's size, fists like clubs. He nearly drowned the boy in the creek before Lewis drove the tomahawk into his ribs again and again and again, even after the body stopped moving. By morning, Lewis was limping back through the forest with his brother Jacob half conscious on his back. His sister was already gone. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't say a word. What followed was a transformation no one could quite explain. Lewis began practicing every day, tracking, shooting, reloading while running. He learned to move without sound, to follow a trail in the rain, to spot footprints buried under leaves. He carried his flintlock like an extension of his own hand and could split a squirrel's skull at 30 yards while sprinting downhill. And he hated the Shawnee with a depth of fury that seemed to burn under his skin like a fever. To Lewis, there would never be peace. There would be no treaties, no negotiations. There would only be blood. They called him the Death Wind. He could run 40 miles in a day and still move silently. He often traveled alone, slipping across the Ohio into enemy territory with nothing but a rifle, a knife, and a satchel of dried meat. He targeted war parties, hunting them one by one, ambushing camps, stealing weapons, freeing captives. He rarely slept in the same place twice and seemed to vanish into the woods like smoke. He left behind bodies, sometimes scalped, sometimes worse. The Shawnee began telling stories of a pale warrior who moved without sound and struck without warning. Mothers warned their children to stay near the fire. Scouts whispered his name around campfires. Some even claimed he couldn't be killed. At Fort Henry, Lewis was both revered and feared. He was still a boy, but something in him had hardened past repair. He didn't laugh like other children. He didn't weep. He didn't look away when someone spoke of killing. He lived for vengeance, and there was always more vengeance to be had. Even when the war calmed. Even when settlers signed papers and drew borders and tried to pretend peace was possible, Lewis kept going. He didn't want peace. He wanted the frontier to remember what had been taken, and he made sure they never forgot. Over the next 10 years, Lewis Wetzel became a legend. Not just for his skill, but for his relentlessness. He once trailed a single Shawnee warrior for 4 days through sleet and snow, across rivers, up rocky hillsides. When he finally caught him, Lewis didn't just kill the man. He tied him to a tree and waited until he woke up before cutting his throat. He once shot a man through the heart from a moving canoe. Another time, he escaped from a group of Delaware captors by dislocating his own shoulder to slip the bindings. There was no limit to his endurance, no softness in his soul. Even his friends grew wary. As the frontier pushed west and the bloodshed faded, some began to question his methods. Was he a hero or a killer with a badge? Some said Lewis had gone too far, that he was no longer defending his people, but hunting his enemies for sport. The lines between justice and cruelty had blurred. When the war finally ended and peace treaties were signed, Lewis didn't stop. He didn't care for papers or signatures. He had scars that never healed. And no piece of parchment could resurrect the mother he'd seen crawl through the mud with an arrow in her chest. No handshakes could unburn the faces of his family. So Lewis kept hunting, until there was nothing left to hunt. He died old and alone in Mississippi, far from the land where his life had been burned to ash. By the time the news reached the Ohio Valley, few remembered the massacre that had created him. The cabins had long since rotted away. The fence posts were gone, the corn patch overtaken by weeds. But in Wheeling, when the wind was sharp and the smoke hung low in the hollows, some still spoke the name Lewis Wetzel in hushed tones. Not as a man, but as a warning, a reminder of what the frontier could do to the human soul. When loss outlives justice, and blood becomes the only answer. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.